Good day, Grade 7. We will now start with lesson 3, where we talk about the effects that earthquakes have on humans. It starts here on page 77, but you can turn to page 78 of your books, and we will discuss it there, where they show us the 4 main effects that earthquakes have on humans. Now, the first one is quite simple, and we can think about it quite logically. Most of these work, if you think about it logically, it will make sense, right? And that's the best way to remember anything. If it makes logical sense to you, then it's the best way to remember it. So the first effect that an earthquake can have on us as humans, quite simply, is injury or death. Meaning we can get injured or we could die. Now, how? How does one get injured in an earthquake? Well, quite simply, buildings will fall on you. And I put it that simple because it is that simple. That is the main way that people get injured or people die during earthquakes. People are indoors. If you think about big cities, if you've ever been in a big city like Johannesburg, you can imagine there's thousands of people living close to each other, big, tall buildings. And if an earthquake would to hit a place like this and the buildings would start to collapse, a lot of people will get injured and die as well, right? So that's the first effect that earthquakes have on us, and it's quite simple. The second one is disease. Now, this is quite interesting because it's not necessarily a direct effect, but more of an indirect effect, meaning that it's not that the earthquake itself causes the disease in you, but it's the effects of the earthquake that causes the disease. For example, it's not like the disease is caused by you shaking about, right? You might feel a bit dizzy, but that's not really the disease that we're looking at. The most way that earthquakes can cause diseases is mostly because of water supplies, right? Water supplies is quite something we are used to in our daily lives. We have access to good water supplies. But as soon as you don't have access to clean, healthy water, and you are thousands of people living close to each other, that's when it gets a bit shaky. And that's how an earthquake can cause a disease. If you imagine, first of all, if they're in your bathroom, there's a pipe that takes away the sewage from the toilet. And there's also a pipe that gives you water in the basin, which is next to the toilet. Now, these two pipes go next to each other like this in a building. If that building is destroyed, what will happen? Both of these pipes might break, get mixed, and so we start talking about contaminated water. So as soon as we don't have a clean water supply anymore, right? Or we have people living in the countryside who used to have clean water supply, but now this supply broke down. They don't have access to this clean water anymore. So what do? They find different water sources. And these different water sources sometimes aren't clean water. They will find standing water, right? And we all know that as soon as water stands still for a certain amount of time, that's when the dangerous stuff starts happening. That's when diseases like cholera starts breeding in this water. And that's how an earthquake can cause disease, right? It rids people of their normal water source, and then either it gets contaminated or they have to find a new one, and the new one also is contaminated. The third effect on us as humans is something we call displacement. Now, displacement is when you are forced to move away from a certain place because of various factors. Now, let's say, for example, an earthquake were to hit the town of Katu, right? Now, if your house was destroyed by an earthquake, it might be quite simple, even though it would cost a lot of money, but you can either maybe fix your home or move to a different home, and you can kind of go on the same way you had before. But now imagine the earthquake destroyed the mines. If Kumba were destroyed, about 80% of the people in Katu would be without jobs. And so they would have to move away to find a different job. Or let's say, for example, the earthquake destroyed the hospitals, it destroyed the schools, even though you might like that. That's not really the point, right? So if all of these stuff are destroyed, then you can't linger there anymore. Then people have to move away to make a living. You can imagine that if you were to stay in a place and all the shops were destroyed and you no longer could buy any food, that even though your house is safe and you are safe, you have to move to a different place because some of these services are now taken away from you. So the displacement also, a very, very prominent effect of earthquakes. It is when the infrastructure is destroyed where you stay. Either the place where your parents work, or the school, or the hospitals, or the shops, emergency services, all of these things together. When people are forced to move because they are destroyed, we call this displacement. And then the last one here is poverty. Now, this is also always funny because I ask children, how can an earthquake, cause you to be poor? And then they'd say, well, the banks get destroyed. But then I usually laugh because we all know that money doesn't work like that, right? Excuse me. So the main thing is obviously your property can get damaged, right? If your home is destroyed by an earthquake and you have to buy a new home, or fix your home, or maybe your dad's car is destroyed and he needs the car to get to work and back, stuff like that, right? So property damage can cause people to become poor because you have to spend a lot of money to either fix or replace the things that was destroyed by the earthquake. But then also something we call the breadwinner, right? The breadwinner is the person in your family who brings home the most money. So let's say the breadwinner is injured or even dies during an earthquake. If you have a family of 6 people, the mother and the father works to maybe bring food home and do clothes and stuff for all 4 children. If the father now dies or are injured in such a way that he can't work anymore, then obviously you can imagine that the people will maybe be much more poorer because of this, right? So if the breadwinner in a family gets injured or dies, then that family can come into poverty as well. And that is a very, very bad and very realistic effect that an earthquake have on people. Quickly to sum up, the 4 main effects: injury and death, buildings fall on you. Simple as that. Diseases, why? Because your normal water supply is either contaminated or destroyed and you have to find a new one. And a lot of times we don't find proper water sources. Displacement. Displacement is when you are forced to move because the infrastructure around your home is destroyed. Infrastructure including jobs, emergency services, hospitals, schools, and so on. And then last one, poverty. Poverty because your property can be destroyed or because the breadwinner can either be injured or die. And therefore this causes poverty. All right, grade 7s, this is a very important part that I just discussed with you. This whole page is altogether part of an essay question. If I were you, I would start practicing this as an essay question, writing it down with an introduction and an ending like we in class practiced already. But definitely copy it into your exercise books. The heading can simply be the effects that the earthquakes have on people, and then make sure you write all 4 of them in detail. All right, thank you. That's all for now. I'll see you again for the next lesson.